first case that will be heard this morning by video conference is Hunters Trail Acquisitions, LLC versus Benjamin Stasik et al. Both sides will have 15 minutes to argue. The appellant may reserve up to 5 minutes for rebuttal. If you'd like to reserve some time for rebuttal and you let me know, I can kind of keep you apprised of the passage of time and what time you have remaining. We do not mention the names of victims, although I don't necessarily think that it's germane to this case, but we do not mention the names of victims or minors. And we have read the briefs and we are ready to proceed when you are.
Thank you, Your Honor. May I please reserve 5 minutes for rebuttal?
Certainly.
Thank you. May it please the court, my name is Thomas Walsh on behalf of the appellant Hunters Trail Acquisition, LLC. This case arises out of the breach of a residential lease agreement. Here, appellees, the defendant tenants, asserted the affirmative defense of failure to mitigate damages. When defendants raise this defense, it is the defendants who bear the burden of proving that defense. However, the trial court here explicitly misstated the law and inappropriately shifted the burden of proving this affirmative defense to Hunters Trail, thereby depriving Hunters Trail of a fair trial. Accordingly, appellant has appealed the trial court's decision to this court. This case presents three main legal questions. First, do tenants who have breached a lease agreement and assert the affirmative defense of failure to mitigate damages bear the burden of proving that affirmative defense by a preponderance of the evidence? Second, did the trial court here misapply or inappropriately shift the burden of proving the failure to mitigate damages? And third, is it reversible error for a trial court to inappropriately shift that burden? The legal issues here should be reviewed de novo. The trial court here inappropriately applied law, and that is an error of law. And as this court has held in Swedlow v. Reigler, that is an issue of law, and issues of law are reviewed de novo. Accordingly, this court should not give deference to the trial court's decision. Addressing the first issue regarding burdens of proof, at the trial court, Hunters Trail, as the landlord plaintiff, had the burden of proving that a breach of a lease occurred and that breach resulted in damages by a preponderance of the evidence. Hunters Trail succeeded in proving that at trial, as was stated by the magistrate in his decision and affirmed by the judge in his order. Landlords in Ohio also do have the duty to mitigate damages. However, as the Supreme Court clarified in Frenchtown Square v. Lemstone, landlords' duty to mitigate damages requires only reasonable efforts be made. And while landlords have the duty to mitigate damages, the affirmative defense of failure to mitigate damages is a burden that is borne by the party that raises that affirmative defense. Here, the defendants, the Stasiks.
Couple of questions, counsel. The trial court, in fact, awarded Hunters everything they asked for, didn't they? Rent for September and October, additional damages for repairs and costs?
No, Your Honor, the trial court did not. Okay. Hunters Trail sought in their prayer for relief $12,228 in total damages. The amount awarded by the trial court was $1,000. And the reason for the diminishing of that damage was that the trial court improperly found that the landlord, Hunters Trail, failed to mitigate damages. So while the trial court found that there was breach and that the damages for all of the back rent were proven, those damages were diminished by the fact that the trial court found Hunters Trail had failed to mitigate damages.
Thank you.
Of course. The law in Ohio is clear. The overwhelming case law and jurisprudence in Ohio states that tenants who raise the affirmative defense of failure to mitigate damages bear the burden of proving that defense by a preponderance of the evidence. The trial court here, to address the second issue, explicitly misapplied this law. It is stated in the judge's order adopting Magistrate Clark's decision, quote, "The plaintiff failed to prove beyond a preponderance of the evidence that it mitigated its damages," end quote. That's at A4 in the appendix. This is an explicit misstatement of the law in Ohio and is in direct conflict with our law. Addressing the third issue, this misstatement of law and misapplication of the burden of proof directly prejudiced Hunters Trail. It deprived Hunter's Trail of a fair trial and significantly reduced its demonstrated damages, as we just discussed. First, even if the burden of proof had been correctly applied in this case, Magistrate Clark's factual findings do not support the ultimate legal conclusion of the trial court. Here, Magistrate Clark found in one of his factual findings that, quote, the only evidence presented at trial with respect to mitigation were statements that the complex was advertised on assorted internet sites, end quote. And that's at 8 in the appendix.
Counsel, let me ask you a question. And I appreciate what you just said in distinguishing the difference between Magistrate Clark's findings and then the ultimate conclusion of the trial court, which of course is what you're appealing here. But I guess where I'm struggling a little bit is when I read the trial court's decision, and please correct me because there are many ways, I guess, to read it. I'm not even certain the trial court got to that conclusion. As I read it, it sounds to me as though the trial court decided, correctly or incorrectly, that you were only challenging facts and didn't have a transcript, and therefore, basically, the end. I don't even see where the trial court got into those other issues in terms of the burden and mitigation. You want to address that for me?
Yes, Your Honor. The objection specifically objected to the magistrate's decision regarding the legal conclusion of mitigation of damages. So when
Be that as it may, I'm talking about what the trial court actually concluded.
the trial court reviewed the magistrate's findings of fact, which are stated in the decision, and concluded its conclusion ultimately was that it adopted the magistrate's decision. And in adopting the magistrate's decision, it restated the law that the magistrate applied and the burden of proof that the magistrate applied. And in doing so, the judge clarified that the magistrate misapplied the law. The judge affirmed the position that the plaintiff failed to prove by a preponderance of the evidence that it mitigated damages. That's not the law in Ohio. So in whatever case happened here, our appeal is not to the factual findings of the magistrate or the trial court in general. Our appeal is to the law and the legal conclusions reached by the trial court, and specifically the burden of proof for failure to mitigate damages. In this case, it's an exceptional one in that the trial court, it's in the order itself, misstating the law, and that's specifically what we are appealing to, or appealing upon. That is our assignment of error, one of our assignment of errors in this case.
Thank you.
To address further on the prejudice for Hunter's Trail, this evidence alone, evidence that the complex was advertised, would not be sufficient to meet the Stasik's burden of proving a failure to mitigate damages. This is evidence of mitigation, if anything at all. And indeed, this evidence was offered through testimony of Daniel Karam, who is an owner-operator of Hunter's Trail. Other evidence would be necessary to prove by a preponderance of the evidence that Hunter's Trail failed to mitigate damages if the burden would have been correctly placed on the Stasiks. This evidence could have at least been attempted to be obtained through discovery, potentially interrogatories or requests for admission, requests for production of documents, or pretrial depositions. None of that was conducted by the Stasiks. And by way of that, there was a lack of evidence presented regarding mitigation. And with that lack of evidence, the burden of proving a failure to mitigate damages could not have been met here by the Stasiks. And indeed, if the burden was properly applied by the trial court, it is our position that they would have failed to prove that affirmative defense, and Hunter's Trail would have been awarded the full amount of damages for which they sought. Furthermore, in shifting the burden of proof, the trial court deprived Hunter's Trail of a fair trial. All litigants, when preparing for trial, must know what burdens of proof they bear so that they can properly prepare for trial, properly prepare their evidence and witnesses. Here, Hunter's Trail relied on the overwhelming case law in Ohio, which states that tenants bear the burden of proving that affirmative defense. And as such, Hunter's Trail prepared for trial accordingly. Had Hunter's Trail known that it bore the burden of proving it mitigated its damages, it could have prepared for trial differently. It could have produced other witnesses, and it could have produced further evidence of mitigation. Moreover, it would be manifestly unfair to plaintiffs across the board to be required to prove or disprove the affirmative defenses that defendants choose to allege. Here, for example, mitigation of damages was just one of 15 different affirmative defenses that the Stasiks presented. If it is going to be required that plaintiffs prove or disprove every affirmative defense that a defendant brings, it would cause manifest injustice to the plaintiffs. Thus, inappropriately shifting the burden of proof prejudiced Hunter's Trail in multiple ways, including depriving them of a fair trial and reducing the demonstrated damages that they were ultimately awarded.
Counsel, I have one more question for you. I think just one. If we had the same factual scenario, but failure to mitigate damages was not raised as an affirmative defense, would it still have been incumbent upon Hunter's Trail to show that it attempted to mitigate damages as part of its duty under the law here?
It would not be required for Hunter's Trail to prove that in order to get the damages that they were asking for. Based on Ohio law, all Hunter's Trail would need to prove is that there was a lease agreement, the lease agreement was breached, and that breach resulted in damages. While they have the duty to mitigate damages in Ohio and make reasonable efforts to mitigate damages, Ohio law does not require that they produce that evidence. And indeed, the affirmative defense of failure to mitigate damages is on the defendants to prove. It is their burden. So the answer to your question, Your Honor, is no, Hunter's Trail would not have to prove that.
Thank you.
And counsel, you are 30 seconds into your 5-minute rebuttal at this point. So you may continue or reserve as you wish.
Thank you, Your Honor. I will briefly conclude and reserve the rest of my time for rebuttal. In briefly concluding, the trial court committed an error of law here, which is explicit in Judge Hoover's order. The trial court's improper shifting of the burden of proof directly resulted in prejudice to Hunter's Trail, and therefore Hunter's Trail respectfully requests that this court reverse the trial court's decision regarding mitigation of damages and remand this case to the trial court for further proceedings consistent with Ohio law. Thank you, Your Honors.
Thank you. Mr. Van Ho.
Thank you, ma'am. Your Honors, if it pleases the court, Attorney Adam Van Ho, on behalf of Mr. and Mrs. Stasik, I respectfully disagree with counsel's assessment of what this case is about. This case is actually about basic rules of appellate review. In this case, we had two major issues. One is appellants failed to perfect their objections to the trial court itself by failing to provide Judge Hoover with a transcript by which he would have been able to go through and evaluate their claims with regards to mitigation, efforts to mitigate, efforts not to mitigate, which I believe was the main basis for Judge Hoover deciding to deny the objections and to approve of the actual decision itself. And the second issue comes down to one of credibility in appellate court decisions and who the finder of fact should be in making credibility decisions. With regards to the mitigation evidence that was actually presented at trial, there was substantial evidence of mitigation and efforts to mitigate made by the Stasiks, but a complete lack thereof by the apartment complex. And what do I mean by that? If the court looks at the full transcript and the record in this case, you will notice that there were two additional defendants that were initially moved to be dismissed out of the case. Those people had actually been people that the Stasiks had managed to get into to take over their lease with the approval of the apartment complex, and then that fell apart. That wasn't due to the Stasiks, that was due to the apartment complex, and there's testimony to support that they went in and attempted to find tenants to take over their lease. There was also testimony in regards to that this was an apartment complex that was in high demand. I believe the Stasiks had testified as to just getting into an apartment complex of this nature was a very long waiting period. When they really get into it, they got into it. They were able to quickly find somebody to take over for it. Yet somehow the landlord decided to let the lease essentially go through the rest of its term being unrented. There was testimony about that there was stuff in the garage, things of that nature. And so the court had to make a credibility claim as to whether or not there actually was an attempt to mitigate damages by the appellants. And in this case,
let me ask you a question if I could. When you
Sure.
just said the court, did you mean during the hearing before the magistrate?
Correct, Your Honor.
And
Yes.
all of the facts that you're discussing right now, how are we able to review that if there was never a transcript before the trial court?
Well, that goes back to just the basic appellate review. I don't think that the Ohio Supreme Court would be too impressed if I tried to take a murder case and did not provide you in the 9th District with a transcript and then say, well, let's give it to you at the Ohio Supreme Court. That's just one of the basic elements, is that Judge Hoover never had the opportunity to review the true merits of the case because the transcript was not properly provided. So I would almost be of the opinion that appellants have waived, by failing to perfect the objections in the lower court, the ability to argue anything with regards to factual based merits.
Okay, but I'm not sure I heard them argue factual based merits.
I think they are when they're saying that there was with regards to the mitigation issues, because they're saying that yes, we did make mitigation. The court is saying that the lower court is saying that the plaintiffs, or I'm sorry, the appellants failed to meet their burden of mitigating damages. But in order to look at that, you have to look at what the underlying facts of the case are. So that's where I'm saying is, if they had provided a transcript to Judge Hoover and Judge Hoover had the opportunity to conduct a review of Magistrate Clark's decision, then he would have had the ability either A, to correct the misstatement of law and say, yes, I find that that the burden may have been improperly stated in the court's decision. However, the same facts applied to the law are correct, and so that the ultimate decision was correct. Because Judge Hoover's the
Counsel, do you read the magistrate's decision as applying the burden on Hunter's Trail, or how do you read that? I mean, obviously that's what the trial court said,
right?
That they failed to prove. But do you read the magistrate's decision misapplying the burden or applying the burden on the apartment owner?
I don't believe. I believe that there is still a duty to mitigate within the law. However, I don't believe that Magistrate Clark's opinion was incorrect. So I believe that Magistrate Clark said that there was mitigation shown, or lack of mitigation by appellants, that there were mitigation efforts by appellees. So I don't believe the magistrate was incorrect in his decision. If that answers your question, Judge Hensel.
It does. Thank you.
And so, but to go back to Judge Callahan's point, this is a case that was improperly presented to Judge Hoover, and it should have been. And the potential impact is that what we would essentially be doing if this case is allowed to proceed. Appellant's case is approved by this court, would to allow this situation where the trial courts are not able to review the merits of a case because they don't have the transcript, and then this court is asking them to essentially be the first level of review as opposed to what it should have been, which is the second level of review. Judge Hoover should have had an opportunity to review the merits of the case, and potentially that would have also shown him or given him the ability to say that Magistrate Clark's statement was not fully in conformity with what he ultimately decided. And so if the court has no additional questions for me, I would yield the rest of my time.
Well, do you agree, counsel, that failure to mitigate is an affirmative defense?
Yes.
And you would also agree then that it is the burden of proof lies with the party asserting that affirmative defense?
I would agree that yes, the parties, when they are asserting affirmative defense, as we did, and as we showed, do have a duty. I would also argue that there is a duty inherent in Ohio law for landlords to mitigate defenses to prevent exactly what happened here, which was the landlord trying to run out the rest of the clock on the lease.
So the question would be, did the trial court properly consider the mitigation evidence?
I believe the trial court properly considered the mitigation evidence. Okay.
How does that square with the the court's apparent statement that it was the landlord's burden to prove mitigation.
Well, but you see, here's two things. One is, if we look at the facts of this case, I think that there was, obviously the court had to make a credibility call as to who it believed with regards to the issue of mitigation and whether or not.
Yeah, I'm not arguing the court did not consider the evidence. My question is, did it properly consider the evidence given the statement that appears that the landlord had the burden to, I think it was proved by preponderance of the evidence that it mitigated its damages?
To be honest, I think that's a statement that I think that's harmless given the nature of the case. Okay. I believe it's a harmless misstatement with regards to, because I do think that there was overwhelming evidence to show a lack of mitigation by appellant and that there were attempts to mitigate by appellee. And so I think that when you combine them, I think that the misstatement of law ultimately is harmless.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, counsel.
Thank you, ma'am.
Counsel, for the appellant, you have about 4 minutes remaining.
Thank you, Your Honor. Briefly to address the matter discussed regarding factual issues, to clarify, appellant is not assigning error to the factual findings or factual issues of the trial court. Our assignments of error and our appeal is exclusively based on the legal issues, the law applied by the trial court, and the legal conclusions rendered by the trial court. As we've discussed, that's regarding the mitigation of damages in the affirmative defense. The transcript, which was just extensively discussed by appellee, was not filed with the objection, and that's clear from the record. However, in appellee's own brief at page 7 of the brief, they argue that the transcript should not be considered by this court. However, we've just spent a good deal of time talking about the transcript and everything within. The factual findings do not affect the law that's clearly stated in the judge's order. The law was incorrectly stated in the judge's order. That's the point of this appeal. And that issue is a plain error. And if the appellee is going to argue that there is a waiver issue here, I would direct the court to Civil Rule 53 D3 B4, which regards waiver of issues on appeal. That subsection of Rule 53 specifically carves out an exception for cases of plain error. I would argue that this case is certainly an exception of plain error. It is plainly stated in the judge's order that the law was misapplied. I do not believe that this is a harmless error. Burdens of proof are extremely important in any litigation, and that error ultimately resulted in a question of fairness for this case, and that's a standard for a plain error, something that is explicit in the record and that affects the fairness of the judicial proceeding below. And regarding the subsection prior to that, Civil Rule 53 D3B3, which regards the transcript being filed with the trial court, when the transcript's not filed, that simply bars the ability to appeal on issues of factual finding, which we are not doing. It is clear that when a transcript isn't filed, this court can still review the law applied and the legal conclusions reached by the trial court. Your Honors, that's...
So, counsel, I have a quick question. So when we look at the objections to the magistrate's decision, we're going to find an objection that says nothing more than the magistrate, by looking at the magistrate's entry, shifted the burden.
That was not what the objection said. Our original objection was to mitigation of damages, and it was to the magistrate's conclusion that the landlord had not mitigated damages. We then cited law regarding the mitigation of damages. In response to the objection, Judge Hoover reviewed the magistrate's decision, and then Judge Hoover explicitly misstated the law and clarified for the court that the wrong law had been applied to the court or the trial before the trial court. That being the burden of proof was shifted to Hunter's Trail instead of being appropriately placed on the tenants. So when Judge Hoover's order pointed that glaring issue out, that issue of law, that legal conclusion issue, one that's very important to this case, illuminating that the court did not properly consider the evidence, we then appealed to this court, as that is a plain error and an error that caused prejudice to Hunter's Trail in this case. Does that sufficiently answer your question, Your Honor?
It does, counsel, and you have about 25 seconds remaining.
All right. With that, then, I will conclude again. And Your Honors, in conclusion, trial court did commit an error of law. It is a plain error. There is an exception to that within Civil Rule 53, as I've discussed. This improper shifting of the burden of proof did result in prejudice to Hunter's Trail. And Hunter's Trail, therefore, respectfully requests that this court reverse the trial court's decision regarding mitigation of damages and remand this case to the trial court for further proceedings consistent with Ohio law. Thank you very much, Your Honors.
Thank you both for your arguments today. The court will take the matter under advisement. We will issue a written decision, which will be mailed to all parties to this appeal, as well as posted on the website for the Ohio Supreme Court and the 9th District. Thank you both, gentlemen. Have a great day.